The 6 most dangerous prisons you could never survive. Let's start with the prisons that were merely completely unsurvivable and work our way towards the ones that make every other prison on this list look like a strongly worded hotel review. Number 6. La Sabaneta, Venezuela, 1995. La Sabaneta prison in Maracaibo, Venezuela was built to hold 700 inmates. At its peak, it held over 3,700. To understand what that means in practical terms, you need to understand that La Sabaneta had no meaningful staff presence inside the facility. Guards controlled the entrance and the perimeter. Inside the prison itself, the inmates ran everything, entirely. There were no guards in the cell blocks, no guards in the yards, no guards anywhere a prisoner might actually be. What filled that vacuum was something that functions like a government, except the only law is violence and the only currency is fear.
Gangs controlled food distribution. If you were not affiliated with the right group, you did not eat. Gangs controlled sleeping arrangements. If you were not affiliated with the right group, you did not sleep in a bed. Gangs controlled everything that happened inside La Sabaneta, and the Venezuelan government's position on this arrangement was essentially to look in another direction and hope for the best. In January 1995, a gang war inside La Sabaneta resulted in the deaths of 196 inmates over the course of a single afternoon. The weapons used included homemade knives, machetes that had been smuggled inside, and firearms. Inside a prison that the government was theoretically running. The official response was to announce an investigation. The investigation concluded that conditions at La Sabaneta needed improvement, which is one way to put it.
Number 5. Diyarbakir Prison, Turkey, 1980. In September 1980, the Turkish military staged a coup and took control of the country. One of the first things the new military government did was fill its prisons with political prisoners, leftists, Kurdish activists, students, journalists, and anyone else who had been on the wrong side of the political situation when the coup happened. Diyarbakir prison in southeastern Turkey became the destination for many of them. What followed over the next several years was documented in enough detail by survivors, human rights organizations, and eventually the Turkish government itself that there is no serious dispute about what happened there. Prisoners were subjected to systematic torture as a matter of routine policy. This included stress positions held for days, electric shock, waterboarding, and methods too specific to detail here that were designed not just to cause pain, but to humiliate and psychologically destroy the person experiencing them. Prisoners were forced to recite nationalist slogans. Failure to recite them correctly resulted in punishment. Prisoners were forced to eat on their hands and knees. Prisoners were subjected to what guards called educational sessions, which were not educational in any conventional sense of the word. The suicide rate among prisoners at Diyarbakir was extraordinarily high. Several prisoners set themselves on fire. Others found other means. The prison became a symbol of the military government's treatment of political prisoners so potent that decades later, Turkish politicians were still arguing about whether to officially acknowledge what had happened there. Several former prisoners became prominent Kurdish political figures after their release. They have described Diyarbakir as the formative experience of their political lives. Not in a good way. Number 4. Camp 22, North Korea, ongoing. There are 6 known political prison camps in North Korea. Camp 22, located in North Hamgyong province near the Chinese border, is or was the largest. The word was is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Satellite imagery suggests Camp 22 may have been significantly downsized or restructured at some point in the early 2010s. The North Korean government has never acknowledged its existence, so everything known about Camp 22 comes from the testimony of the small number of people who escaped from it and made it to the outside world. What they describe is a system of total imprisonment that operates on a principle called guilt by association. If you are sent to Camp 22, your entire family comes with you. Your children are born inside the camp. Your children's children are born inside the camp. You do not serve a sentence at Camp 22. You simply live there until you die there. The average lifespan inside the camp was not something that needed to be managed because the camp's conditions managed it automatically.
Prisoners at Camp 22 were used as forced labor in mines, logging operations, and agricultural facilities. The food ration was calibrated to keep prisoners alive and working, but not to allow full physical development. Children born inside the camp were often visibly malnourished and physically stunted. Former guards who defected from North Korea have described Camp 22 as a place where the prisoners were not really considered to be people in any meaningful sense that the guards recognized. You are born in Camp 22. You work in Camp 22. You die in Camp 22. The outside world, for most prisoners, was not even a concept.
Number 3. Carandiru, Brazil, 1992. Carandiru was the largest prison in Latin America. Located in Sao Paulo, Brazil, it was built to hold 4,000 inmates, and at its peak held over 8,000. On October 2, 1992, a fight broke out between two inmates in Pavilion 9. The fight escalated. The prison administration called in the military police. What happened next is not disputed in its broad outline. The military police entered the prison, moved through the cell blocks, and killed 111 prisoners. The official initial position was that the prisoners had been killed during a violent confrontation. Subsequent investigations, autopsies, and survivor testimony established a different picture. Many of the prisoners who died had been shot at close range. Some had been shot multiple times. Several showed evidence of having been shot while in their cells, rather than in any active confrontation. 111 people died. No police officer was ever imprisoned for the killings. The case moved through the Brazilian legal system for over 2 decades. Convictions were obtained, appealed, overturned. The last major legal proceedings concluded with no officer serving prison time for what happened on October 2, 1992. Carandiru itself was demolished in 2002. A public park was built on the site. The park has a jogging track.
Number 2. ADX Florence, United States, 1994. ADX Florence in Fremont County, Colorado, is the only federal supermax prison in the United States. It is sometimes called the Alcatraz of the Rockies. It houses approximately 400 of the most dangerous and high-profile prisoners in the federal system. Terrorists, cartel leaders, spies, and people the government has decided require a level of isolation beyond what any other facility can provide. You have just arrived at ADX Florence. Your cell is approximately 7 feet by 12 feet. It contains a concrete bed, a concrete desk, a concrete stool, and a toilet and sink combined into a single unit. The furniture cannot be moved because it is part of the floor. The cell door is solid steel. There is a narrow window that provides natural light, but is positioned so that you cannot see anything through it except sky. You cannot see the ground. You cannot see other prisoners. You cannot see a single other human being from inside your cell. You will spend 22 to 24 hours per day in this cell. On days when you are allowed outside your cell, you will move to an individual exercise room, a slightly larger concrete space with a small opening in the ceiling. You will not interact with other prisoners. You may have limited telephone contact with family members. You may receive mail after it has been screened. This will be your life for years, possibly decades, possibly forever. Former prisoners and human rights organizations have argued extensively that the conditions at ADX Florence constitute torture under international law. The United States government has argued that the facility represents a necessary response to the most dangerous individuals in the federal system. Both of these things can be simultaneously true. Several prisoners at ADX Florence have developed severe psychiatric symptoms. Several have attempted suicide. Several have begged to be transferred to general population prisons, despite those prisons carrying significantly higher risks of physical violence. They preferred the possibility of being physically harmed to the certainty of complete isolation. That should tell you something.
Number 1. Tadmor Military Prison, Syria, 1980. Tadmor Military Prison was built by the French during their occupation of Syria and sits near the ancient ruins of Palmyra in the Syrian desert. It operated as a military prison under the Assad government from the 1970s until its formal closure in 2001 and its brief reopening during the Syrian civil war. Amnesty International described Tadmor as a place of no return. That is not a rhetorical flourish. That is a factual description of how the prison functioned. When Hafez al-Assad's government used Tadmor, it was primarily to hold political prisoners, members of the Muslim Brotherhood, political opponents,
and anyone the government considered a threat to the regime's stability. The conditions documented by the small number of survivors who made it out include systematic torture, starvation rations, and a system of collective punishment, where the actions of one prisoner would result in punishment for an entire cell block. In June 1980, one day after a failed assassination attempt on Hafez al-Assad, a unit of the defense companies, the president's brother's private military force, entered Tadmor prison and executed between 500 and 1,000 prisoners. In a single morning. No trial, no process, no warning. The prisoners were in their cells, the soldiers came in, and then they were gone. The Syrian government did not acknowledge the massacre. It was not reported in Syrian state media. The outside world learned of it primarily through the accounts of prisoners who were present and survived and eventually made it out of Syria. Tadmor was partially destroyed by ISIS in 2015 when they captured Palmyra. The ruins of the prison still stand in the Syrian desert, beside the ruins of one of the ancient world's greatest cities. Both sets of ruins are what happen when the people with the power decide that the people without it do not matter. One set of ruins is 2,000 years old. The other is not.